Welcome back to another episode of Global Pulse in 60 Seconds. I'm your host, Khizra Ahmed, and today I'm delighted to welcome Kristen Mittal, co-founder and CEO of Mittal Consulting. Kristen is a highly respected regulatory affairs leader with over a decade of experience supporting medical device companies, from early-stage innovators to Fortune 500 organizations, as they navigate complex regulatory pathways with confidence and clarity. Kristen, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, Kisra, thanks so much for having me here. Really excited to be on the podcast and chat with your audience. And I'm always excited to talk about med device regulatory affairs.
Thank you. So, Kristen, I'll let you introduce yourself to the audience. You've built a really impressive career in regulatory affairs, and now you lead Mittal Consulting. What first drew you into this place, and what really shaped your leadership style?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I was really fortunate. At the beginning, I had an undergraduate and graduate degree in biomedical engineering. But while I was doing these studies, I had the opportunity to do internships at different medical device startups and small companies in the area. And through that, I actually happily and pleasantly fell into regulatory affairs. And I think that used to be the journey for most. I think regulatory affairs is a bit more common now. People know about it, but back when I was going through, usually that's how it happened. So I was working in a quality role for a small medical device manufacturer, and those requirements finished. They had an FDA audit coming up and an ISO audit coming up, and they said, "Okay, well, we're so small, can you help us with that?" And I said, "Okay, sure." And after going through that process, it was love at first sight, and I've been on that path ever since. So I think I was really fortunate to find something that really fit my passion and my skill set, and I've been on that path for the decade since doing FDA submissions.
Brilliant. That's just such a powerful and personal journey. And it really shows how, regulatory leadership isn't just all about technical, it's more about our passion and about guiding people. When you work with early stage medtech teams, let's talk a bit about that. What are the most common misconceptions founders have about strategy, and what do you wish more innovators understood from day one?
Yeah, I think doing regulatory at a small company versus a large company is very different. They have very different challenges. So, in my experience over the decade, I worked at all different sizes of companies, small, medium, and large. And I found that the startups were the ones who were really bringing the innovation to market really quickly. The large companies were definitely doing it as well, but because of their size and complexity as a company, they just can't bring it to market as quickly because they have a larger reputation, a lot more risks they have to be able to be cognizant and wary of. So it just takes more time. So these startups were really where the innovation was coming to market fast and very cutting edge, not just Me Too types of devices or slight incremental changes, but very cutting edge changes. And they had the most complex regulatory pathways and the most challenges ahead of them because of this novelty. But unfortunately, it seemed that most of them did not have access or ability to tap into really highly qualified regulatory expertise. And we know that regulatory is one of the biggest hurdles to getting devices to the market. So that's why we created this, and that's why we specifically work in this niche of medical device startups who are changing the current standard of care, working on very novel and very complex types of products, because we know that they have different challenges. And you asked me what the challenges are. So they are the fact that it's so novel that oftentimes there's not a benchmark to compare against. So we really have to work early and often with the FDA to work through these different types of novelties to be able to set them up for success of eventually creating the data that they need to be able to show that it's safe and effective and be able to work through that FDA approval process. So that's really the type of niche that we work in, to be able to help more of these very cutting edge technologies that have a lot of promise actually be able to get into patients' hands at a large scale.
I love that perspective because it reframes regulatory from being the final hurdle into something that should be built into the foundation from the very beginning. And Kristen, you've worked across class one, two, and three devices. Now, just very briefly for our audience, what changes when the device class changes one, and how should founders think differently as risk and evidence requirements increase?
Yeah, for a novel product that's very game changing to come to the market, regulatory is really one of the first things a company should be thinking about and not at the end of the exercise checkbox because it's going to have heavy influence of what type of testing is required, how they're going to set up their clinical studies. So thinking about this very early on is important. And thinking about regulatory as making sure to get in correspondence with the FDA and get them on the same page and build that relationship is really important.
Now, that's such an important distinction because the higher the risk category, the more structure and clarity you would need early on and not later on, I believe.
Yeah.
Now, when talking about efficient FDA submissions, I mean, you touched upon that bit, and clear regulatory planning, what does moving fast safely actually look like in practice? And how do you help teams avoid mistakes that could potentially slow them down later on?
Yeah, the purpose of regulatory, it's one of its functions is to de-risk the process as much as possible. For any type of device, but especially a novel device, there's a lot you don't know. There's a lot of unknowns of whether you're going to pass the preclinical tests, the bench testing, the clinical tests. There's a lot of unknowns of whether FDA is going to be on board of how you're thinking about setting up certain types of tests or thinking about setting up certain types of things. So the more we can have correspondence with the FDA, the more we can have certain big picture questions more or less agreed upon at a high level or even more into the specifics and answered. How can we set up milestones along the journey to make sure we're de-risking that last marketing submission to the FDA? So what can we do so that we know when we get there, we're going to be tackling more or less more simple questions like labeling and very specific wording there, as opposed to the larger questions of, wow, we're not really on the same page with your clinical study, right? Things that we can come back from, not things that we can't come back from necessarily.
That's a brilliant way to put it. And it's not about rushing, it's about being organized, I would say intentional, and building the
Yeah.
right evidence story. Now, expanding on this a bit, when companies are thinking globally, especially about EU pathways, what do innovators often overlook? And how does post-market responsibility fit into building real long-term trust and adoption?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely thinking about different types of markets of where to sell your device is very important before embarking on trying to collect the data and go through that marketing application for that country. I would say in general, US and EU are some of the big markets to go into because a lot of other countries, once you have one of those, will accept those in lieu of going through their own country's application. That's not true for all countries, but for many other countries. So these are some of the two big markets because they have very strict regulatory requirements you're going through. I will say once the EU MDR transition happened and there was an update to how devices were regulated in Europe over the last many 5 to 7 years now, this has a significant influence on the amount of technology coming into Europe, actually, because the bar from a timing and a cost perspective has gone up dramatically. So actually, one of the notified bodies recently came out a couple weeks back with a study that said their small to medium size medical device clients will actually have told them they will not be re-registering once their certificates expire in Europe because of the cost burden. There's already some regulations coming out to make this a little less burdensome and address that issue. But for a lot of our companies coming to the US first, is not necessarily it's an easier pathway, but it's they like the transparency of it, to be honest. There's a pre-submission process to really get FDA on board. You still have to have really great data. You still have to have high quality product, really show safety and effectiveness, but the predictability and the cost is actually winning for the US. So I would say when you think about other markets outside the US, especially Europe, really dig into the commercialization and market access piece very hard. Really make sure there's a compelling commercialization reason to go to that market and go through that extra cost and time to make it worthwhile. Because in a lot of the cases, it's not there. And it's much better to know that early on and maybe postpone that type of activity until you're in a different stage of the company instead of blowing through a tremendous amount of capital and then learning that lesson.
Absolutely. And success isn't just about getting approved. It's about staying compliant, safe, and as you mentioned, scalable once the product
Yeah.
is in the real world. And this leads me to my final question, Kristen. So, in 60 seconds, what is your single most important piece of advice for MedTech founders and leaders who want to innovate quickly while still protecting patients and building trust and creating long-term healthcare impact?
Yeah, I like to joke with our clients that yes, it's a difficult regulatory journey to get us through the FDA and approve. It's something that is difficult, but we can definitely do and will do for you. However, that is really not going to be the hardest journey for very novel products. The hardest journey is going to be the journey from that approval to actually getting market adoption, reimbursement, and commercialization. And we know for our client type of very novel, very complex breakthrough types of devices, it takes on average of 5 to 7 additional years after FDA approval to get those reimbursement metrics in place to be able to get compensated for the device. A lot of companies can't go that extra 5 to 7 years before they get reimbursement in place. So we really like to say, if you're very novel and complex, think about regulatory and reimbursement very hard at the beginning and make sure it's tied into your commercialization strategy because that's one of the fundamental things that is either going to make or break a novel technology. It's great to have a novel technology, but if you can't get it into the hands of the millions, then it hasn't really done anything actually.
That's such a strong message. Thank you so much, Kristen, for sharing that so clearly and for the impact you continue to make across the MedTech ecosystem. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure chatting with you as well.